Support for this and all the free content of Addressing Gettysburg is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg.
Okay, we're testing things one more time. Can everybody hear me? You can. Hooray! It's working. Can you turn up just a touch? Good? Yep, I think it's good. Can everybody hear me now? Yeah. All right. I don't have to use shadow puppets to do this. Thanks. Hey, well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Gettysburg National Military Park. I'm John Heiser, historian here at the Division of Interpretation and Visitor Services. And this afternoon's program is a little bit different this time. I had no idea there were so many fans of mules that were going to show up. Some poor lady called the other day and thought it was actually going to be a mule demonstration. But they wouldn't, the foundation didn't like the idea of me bringing mules into the amphitheater. So, spoil sports. I was always kind of fascinated by this. We always talk about the heroes of the armies, the military men, the mighty steeds and everything else, all the other supporting features of a battle and campaign. And as all of us here who have read extensively or walked the battlefield, we all have our heroes. Everybody recognizes these two men. They're heroes one sort or another to everybody that's even slightly interested in the Civil War, let alone the Gettysburg campaign. And like any particular event, there's always the villains. The guys who may not be the good or the bad, you know, they have their problems, their ways of doing things, and it kind of mixes the story up. So with any story, there's always heroes and villains. But one thing all these men have tied together, that ties them together, is this particular animal. The horse, right? The horse has led men into battle for thousands of years, especially in the American Civil War. The horse was the most dependent upon animal for every little facet of battle. The mighty steed would take the general, the colonel, the adjutant, right into the jaws of battle, the most chaotic type of fighting you can imagine, and then bear that same rider out again to safety. It's amazing what horses did. And horses were used, unfortunately, to sacrifice and drag artillery into the field. Everyone knows the story of the 9th Massachusetts Battery, how they lost 80 of 88 horses on the Trosel Farm on July 2nd. So horses have been commemorated here at Gettysburg in many different ways, in bronze on the equestrian monuments, and as in stone on the cavalry monuments around the field. But the one four-legged animal that's never really been commemorated here or discussed during the entire war, and I'm not talking about Sally the dog, is this poor creature here. Equus asinus, the mule. Both hero and villain. He's the mutt of the equine world. And it is the mule that will bear the burdens of supply and demand for the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac, not just during this campaign, but throughout the entire war. And the history of the mule in America is kind of interesting. It goes all the way back to pre-colonial times. Mules were introduced during the colonial days kind of as a mistake, for lack of a better term. It always takes a male donkey and a mare to make a mule. Mules really weren't seen as being that useful until people like George Washington, who owned large plots of land, realized that mules were really necessities as far as working the land, hauling freight, the heavy work that horses could do, but they just did not have the longevity to do. Mules were those brutes that could do that, though they did have these traits of stubbornness, inability to get along, cantankerous, the whole 9 yards. But Washington really thought, as did others, that the mule was very useful in America. But mules really weren't, their use was not widespread by civilians. It was primarily by freightmen hauling freight from the hills to the cities in the east and things like that. The military did not really use mules until the war with Mexico in the 1840s. Prior to that, they had used horses to drag their wagon trains behind the armies. But it was the war with Mexico when they found out the mule was more hardy and adaptable to dry conditions, especially in the Southwest, that they were easier to handle and could handle the large loads that the armies needed to have them haul. It was no different when the American Civil War broke out in 1861. The Union Army recognized right away that the mules were necessities to supply and demand. To keep these armies supplied in the field, it had to be mules. Kentucky and Missouri, the two border states, were the largest producers of mules. And right at the very beginning, even before the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter, federal agents from the Quartermaster Department went to those states, to every market they could get a hold of, and began to purchase mules. In the first year of the war, the Union purchased around an estimated 40,000 mules. That's an incredible amount of animals they had to buy. And it wasn't just buying them, it was then transporting them to Washington or posts out west like St. Louis, where they were then formed into these supply teams to supply the various armies that would be out in the field. And as necessity grew, as the war grew on, the necessity for more and more animals grew. For soldiers of both armies, I'm really kind of surprised by this, but a lot of men who went into the Army, even farmers, did not have a lot of experience with mules. Mules were not the most common farm animal you might think of, apart from horses, draft horses, different types of horses. And I'm not a horse expert at all. I'm certainly not an expert on the mule. But I do know that a lot of these soldiers wrote that the mule was a completely different animal to many of them. And it became kind of the butt of jokes for a lot of the men because the animal was basically kind of a funny-looking, odd-looking animal and acted odd. One soldier wrote, he was a strange creature, a brute, a loud and cantankerous beast that could only be controlled by a selected few, the mule driver. And what became legendary in the Army, not just the mule itself, but was the man or men who could control those mules, the mule driver, the teamsters. They were a different breed, usually selected from the ranks to drive the battery wagon or the baggage wagon or the ordnance wagon. Most of these men were farmers, but they had never handled large teams of animals like this. Ulysses S. Grant wrote in his memoir that the average mule driver, most of them were principally foreigners who had enlisted in large cities, and with the exception of a chance drayman among them, it's not probable that any one of these men who reported that reported themselves as competent teamsters had ever driven a mule team in their entire lives, or indeed that many had any previous experience in driving any animal, whatever, to harness. So, it was a learning experience for a lot of these men. And what soldiers did recognize after a while is watching the teams pass by and experience with the teams on the roads that the teamsters had a language all to their own. That was very unique. Often the air was colored blue with the amount of cursing that these men could produce, but obviously only the mules could understand that. John Billings, who wrote the wonderful book Hardtack and Coffee, Memoirs of Service during the war, it was remarkable to me, he devoted one entire chapter to mules. Not horses or anything else, but mules. And he talked about this. It was a remarkable thing to see these men manage these large teams of mules hauling these large wagons. He wrote that the drivers, the skilled drivers, had one rein in one hand and the long whip in the other. And by pulling the reins, the brutes would go to the left, to direct them to the right. One or more short jerks of it were given accompanied by a sort of gibberish, which only the mule drivers acquired in their business, and only the mules could understand. It makes sense, because a lot of that gibberish was probably something in mule language was like, go to the right, go to the left, stop. And to the mule it was, blah, 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 blah. And the mules would always answer back. We look at these pictures of these photographs, and the key element here is the wagon they're hauling. The Army wagon was really the top line transportation at that time. The U.S. Army wagon, which was made of oak with iron fittings, weighed quite a bit. I don't know the exact weight. Somebody can probably spout something out. I really don't know it. But I do know that each wagon was capable of carrying 2,800 pounds of every type of category of military equipment you can think of. Medical, engineering, commissary substance, ammunition, personal baggage, regimental baggage. These wagons were depended upon to carry all that equipment for the Army no matter where they went. And even an Army that traveled as light as the Army of Northern Virginia and Stonewall Jackson's Corps always had a line of wagons following it, carrying this extra baggage to keep that Army attainable and keep that Army in the field. So the Army wagon could haul about 2,800 pounds. I'm not good with math. I can maybe count pennies in my pocket. I'm not really good at math, but I was looking at some of the statistics and thinking about this, that the average wagons, 200 some wagons, carrying that much weight, that's a lot of tonnage on these roads. It's an incredible amount of tonnage they're hauling following the armies. The Army of the Potomac's ordnance train during the Gettysburg campaign brought 270 additional rounds per artillery piece in the ordnance train itself. We're talking about 12-pound, 10-pound, 12-pound shells with the powder bags attached. As far as small arms ammunition was concerned, the Army of the Potomac brought almost 1,500,000 rounds of ammunition with them, apart from the 60 rounds that were carried on each soldier. Think about the volume of cartridges that are now being packed in these wagons following the armies. And simple math, 1,500,000 rounds works out to about a little over 18,000 cases, and that works out to about, I think, a little over 500 and some tons of ordnance. Small arms alone.
400 some wagons.
Small arms alone. It's an amazing amount of weight that this stuff is carrying. But not only supplies for man, these wagons also had to call supplies for the animals themselves, the horses and the mules. They had difficulties, I think, in the first year of the war, especially in the Union Army, of deciding what was the basic ration for these four-legged animals, be it a horse or a mule. And it wasn't really until 1863 that Brigadier General Rufus Ingalls decided and ordered that this is the basic ration that the animals should have, which included 12 pounds of oats, 12 pounds or 14 pounds of hay, and water limited to 5 gallons in the morning, 5 gallons in the evening. One of these wagons could haul approximately 108 rations for horses or mules. So not only were you hauling stuff for the human element, the infantry, the artillery, the cavalry, but you're also hauling all these rations for the animals as well. And only 108 rations in that wagon could be emptied just like that by a cavalry regiment. It would take at least 4 wagons to feed a cavalry regiment alone just for one day. So we talk about the volume. And you think about water, one estimate was that to water all the horses and mules in the Army of the Potomac would take about 358,000 gallons a day. Some of them go to Willoughby Run right now because it's flooded. That's an incredible amount of water that was necessary for these animals. Apart from the animals hooked to the wagons, there's also the pack mules. A lot of individual soldiers and even regiments had pack mules that accompanied the Army. These were usually privately owned or sometimes owned by the Army. The individual mules were not considered workable in teams, so they outfitted them or loaded them up with extra supplies on top. In this case, this Edwin Forbes drawing is intriguing in that this poor mule following the column is carrying extra overcoats and blankets thrown aside by some of the soldiers in his regiment. And it was very common at the trail of the column to see not just the wagons, but also a number of individual pack mules falling along. And pack mules were very important because at times, especially in the Overland Campaign and the Army had swept through Georgia and the Carolinas, pack mules were primarily the bearers of ammunition and equipment for those armies as they moved. Where mules were important for the wagons and trains, initially where horses were thought usable, horses were more important for the cavalry and the artillery for a number of reasons. Their swiftness, their ability to move, their ability not to be shocked by shell fire in combat, and things like all the noise and racket going on. Mules are completely different, just because of their temperament. And Billings noted this also. He said, for certain kinds of work, horses must be had, mules simply would not do. The horse was good for any kind of service, as a beast of burden, up to the limits of endurance. Not so his half-brother, the mule. The latter was particular as a kind of service he performed. Like a great many bipeds that entered the Army, he preferred to do military duty in the safe rear. He must therefore be made available for draft in the trains, the ammunition force trains, supply, and the bridge trains. During the course of the war, the Union Army used an estimated 1 million mules. Amazing amount of animals. I'm not really sure how true that is. That number's been passed around, that statistic's been passed around quite a bit in the past couple of years by researchers, but nobody really seems to know. And that is because the quartermaster records that we've researched and ones I've looked at really don't tell you how many mules are in the supply trains at one particular time. They count the number of wagons, but you can't always say, well, there's 6 mules per wagon, because that's not always the case. At times there were shortages in the Army of the Potomac, and as well as the Army of Tennessee, there were great shortages of mules to haul wagons. And so instead of taking horses from the cavalry, which were more important to cavalry, moving to the supply trains, they just reduced the size of the mule trains. So instead of 6 mules on a wagon, it might be only 4. It just depended, but we do know that Union agents continued to purchase mules wherever they could find them. They'd drive into large corrals near the camps, near depots. There was a large depot in Washington and Alexandria, another one on the peninsula near Fort Monroe, and that's where the mules were then selected, sent out to the armies, trained, and become part of these teams. For example, the Union Army in 1864 purchased 87,791 mules that year to help the supply trains in the Army. Care of the mules was not always the most graceful thing. They were hard and difficult to manage because of their cantankerous moods, their stubbornness, and determination. And as one soldier wrote, the last place you wanted to be on earth was behind a mule, because they had a swift kick, could drive you right across the field. He would rather face rubber bullets than face the rear of a mule. So you can only imagine, you hear that term, kicks like a mule, well, now you know why. Manage the mules, though, mules, they did find out, were not as susceptible to the same type of ailments and as many problems that you would have with a horse that needed a lot of attention. Mules really were pretty resilient when it came to different types of climate, different types of weather. They only suffered from 2 major types of disease, glanders, which is a respiratory disease also shared, unfortunately, by horses, and what they call black tongue disease, which is similar, it's also respiratory, cause scarring of the lungs. There were veterinarians in both armies that constantly checked the animals. At times they couldn't check every animal, but it was up to the teamsters and the drivers to look after their animals health-wise, and if there was a problem, then to go to the veterinarian when the veterinarian ever showed up to the Army to try and treat them. Unfortunately, as time went on, if an animal became very, very ill and very sick, they were simply disposed of. So the size of a baggage train, you can only imagine. I mentioned earlier Brigadier General Rufus Ingalls, who was the chief quartermaster for the Army of the Potomac. He was aided by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Green Sawtell, assistant quartermaster, and he worked in cooperation with Captain Henry Francis Clark, who was the chief of subsistence and commissary. Those 3 officers were primarily important for the baggage and the subsistence trains that followed the Army of the Potomac during the Gettysburg campaign. And this is an example of one small portion. Basically, this is about the size of a wagon train attached to a corps during the Army of the Potomac's campaign into Pennsylvania, following the Army of Northern Virginia. You can mount, there are ambulances down here in the front. You exclude the ambulance, the rest is all baggage subsistence. This does not include the ordnance train. The ordnance train was separate from the baggage and commissary train. The ordnance train always came first. And they were subdivided into, for lack of a better term, a company. The ordnance train was always set aside from the commissary and the baggage and the medical train. And the problem that Ingalls found, especially at the beginning of this campaign, was there were so many wagons on the road, it was clogging up the roads. There were so many problems with this they experienced in Northern Virginia, especially with the campaigns around Fredericksburg, the Mud March, the Chancellorsville campaign. Often troops could not get through because the roads were always clogged up with countless wagons belonging to who knows who. He tried to at least scale this down a little bit because some of the wagons moved empty. Why have those wagons out there if you're not going to use them? So he scaled this down a bit, but wasn't until after this campaign was over he was able to do that. And he designated a supply train for subsistence, forage, and quartermaster stores for 1,000 men, cavalry or artillery. There will only be 7 wagons for sustenance and baggage, 4 wagons for small arms ammunition, that's the ordnance train, small arms. For hospital supplies, for every 1,500 men, there were 3 wagons set aside specifically for the hospital stores. Now, apart from these, there's also Jonathan Letterman's medical train, which is about 200 wagons. There are also the Corps hospital trains with ambulances. That's another 100 or so wagons on top of that. Pack mules that accompany them, all added up, it's an amazing amount of animals that are trotting the roads in Maryland and Pennsylvania, and the wagons coming northward. The artillery would have 3 separate wagons for each artillery brigade. Now, the wagons would carry light baggage as well as ordnance and important stores, commissary stores, forage for the animals. The 4 wagons set aside specifically to carry extra artillery ammunition, the 270 rounds per gun I mentioned earlier. There were 2 additional wagons in the supply train with additional baggage, tents, parts for the carriages, sponges, you name it. It's all there in these wagons. So all in told, if we look at and do our math properly, and again, I'm not a math whiz, at minimum, the Army of the Potomac has 1,280 wagons following it through Northern Virginia, Maryland, and into Pennsylvania. 1,280 wagons at minimum. It doesn't count the ambulances. But all told, you add it up, with a little over 1,000 wagons in the subsistence train alone, that's approximately 6,036 mules. That's a lot of water, that's a lot of grain, that's a lot of feed. Each one led by a driver. The weight of supplies, average of 2,400 pounds per wagon, works out to about 3,072,000 pounds, about 1,536 tons, something like that. It's an amazing amount of equipment that had to be moved by these armies to support the armies in the field. Army Northern Virginia is a completely different ball of wax. What little records survive about the Army Northern Virginia, sure they had wagon trains, but their wagons are not like the typical Army wagon unless they captured them. They have a lot of U.S. Army wagons they've captured, pick up while in Virginia and the Peninsula Campaign, things like that. But a lot of the wagons in the Army Northern Virginia are very, very different. They're larger wagons, or in some cases very smaller wagons. They don't have the number of animals that the Union Army has. So in some cases, the supply wagons are driven by horses, draft horses, or in some cases, mules. A lot of them are captured mules. But the more animals they remove from the southern farms, the harder it is to farm that land. And there are shortages of mules, especially in the South, in Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia, to help farm the land. I know at one point, I think it was in North Carolina, the Quartermaster Department attempted to purchase mules to plant the supplies that they had sent to the Army of Northern Virginia, and they had great difficulty in finding enough mules to even purchase, let alone send to the Army. I'm sure all the southern states went through the same thing. Lieutenant Colonel Briscoe Baldwin, who was the Chief of Ordnance, worked with Lieutenant Colonel James Corley, Chief Quartermaster, to at least organize the Confederate supply train in a similar fashion to the Union supply train, though in this case, the supply trains were stuck specifically to a division. There was not like an all Army supply train. And we don't really know the exact number. I think what stymied me in doing research for this was no one really knows how many wagons accompanied the Army of Northern Virginia across the Potomac River as they came up here. The estimates run anywhere from 1,100 to 2,000 wagons. Well, they picked up wagons, captured wagons at Winchester, around Harper's Ferry. Again, they took wagons and mules and horses from southern farms. They came this way. So by the time they went back to Potomac, they may have had as many as at least 1,800 wagons. But no one really seems to know for sure because there just is no particular inventory of that. But still, you count up all the animals with that on top of the approximately 20,000 some animals, horses and mules with the Army of the Potomac, add another 15 to 18,000 horses and mules for the Army of Northern Virginia, that's a lot of animals tromping around this ground in Adams County for a couple of days. Stories that come out of this battle. There are a few here and there where I was kind of floored that I didn't find much more than just little bits and pieces of stories and things like that. One of the most interesting stories, this particular one told by Captain F.M. Colston, who was in Alexander's artillery battalion. He had a friend who was in the cavalry, and instead of riding a horse, this young man named Jim chose this white mule he named Simon. Well, Simon was better than any horse, and Jim always talked about how great Simon was, didn't need that much care, really could take care of himself, was just as fast, as swift as any horse in the regiment, would go wherever the others went, and was so obedient. He was just so proud of Simon, he would never have a horse. Well, along the way, in either southern Pennsylvania or somewhere over in Maryland, they stop at this farmer's house, and they're having their supper. The farmer is kind of sympathetic to them, giving them a nice meal, when suddenly somebody says, "Hey, there's Yankees coming. Run, boys, run." Well, it's a small contingent. And then scramble, they hop on their horses, and they ride right through the gate. Jim hops on Simon, goes towards the gate, and in true mule fashion, Simon stops. So Jim is now like, "All right, Simon, we go to the back gate." Goes right to the back gate, and once again, Simon balks. Boom, stops. And in frustration, as Jim looks over his shoulder and sees these Union troopers now riding down on him, he throws his arms around Simon and says, "For God's sake, Simon, please go somewhere." We know that Jeb Stuart captured around 200 wagons or so outside of Rockville, Maryland during the campaign, all Union wagons with mule teams. One difficulty he had, doubtless, was getting those wagons to follow him, because in the capture of the wagons, a lot of the drivers were either shot or ran away. The teamsters bolted. In some cases, the teamsters cut traces and rode away on their own mules. So those wagons, either they're heavily loaded, were also at a disadvantage to Stuart. They made him move slower than maybe he wanted to move. And maybe that's perhaps why Lee remarked, "Those wagons are an impediment to me now. They're a burden rather than being something that we should be proud of." It was great to have them supplemented the Army for the Army supply system, but unfortunately some of those same mules drowned in the Potomac River in the crossings overnight of July 14th. They either bolted off the bridges or got to the middle of the fords and were swept away. One of the other things that strikes me too is the number of mules that constantly were rotating back and forth. When a wagon came and dropped off its supplies, it didn't just hang around the Army, it went somewhere. There are supply depots in Frederick and Westminster. Those are the two main supply depots during the Army, during the campaign of Gettysburg. So the Union Army constantly has this line of wagons going back and forth to these depots to pick up new supplies, bring them up to the Army, and drop them off. And overnight of July 2nd, as the fighting has died down on Culp's Hill, some of the Confederate soldiers are going to plainly hear mule teams on the Baltimore Pike, no more than a quarter mile away, bringing supplies up to the Army of the Potomac's position and dropping materials off up there at Cemetery Hill, primarily ordnance and some commissary stores. But all night long, these wagons are rolling with their mules. One of the most intriguing stories about Gettysburg happened out here on the McPherson farm on July 1st. This was written about in Gettysburg Magazine a couple years ago. Vance Hurtigan found it in a kind of an obscure place, but the story goes like this. Ordnance Sergeant Jerome Watrous of the 6th Wisconsin Infantry was in charge of the division's ordnance train, composed of about 10 wagons, all carrying small arms ammunition. And on July 1st, the wagon train arrived, the 10 wagons pulled up on Cemetery Hill about midday. Watrous's men weren't there more than maybe 10 or 15 minutes when the staff officer rode up saying that there was ammunition shortages up with the brigade and the division. He had to get out there right away. Now, these ordnance trains are mules, right? Mules don't like shot and shell. They don't like things going off around their ears. They don't like this kind of stuff going on. They're hard to control. But Watrous later wrote and spoke that these mules seemed to perk up at the sound that their men needed them. He took all 10 wagons, charged through the fields across town to the Lutheran seminary. Once he got to the seminary, there was no way to get ammunition right out to the men, or there was no one there to unload it at the seminary. He took 3 wagons, and in a charge, drove these wagons, all 3 of them, out around the McPherson farm, and along the way, 2 soldiers in each wagon were throwing boxes of ammunition out as fast as they could. 50 to 60-pound boxes of ammunition. Watchers followed behind with an axe and split the boxes open so the ammunition could be distributed. And even though it was specifically meant for the 1st Division, it didn't matter who you were, what division you were attached to your brigade, everybody benefited by this infamous charge of the Mule team out there on July 1st. It's all under fire. One of the Teamsters, his name was Bert O'Connor, the 7th Wisconsin. He was the 3rd or 4th wagon in the line. And he wrote later on, said, "You can bet we made those 10 mule teams spin along. It seemed as those mules knew that glorious old Wadsworth's gallant men were getting short of ammunition, and we must get to them without a moment's delay." After the 3 wagons rolled out and came back empty, watchers gathered all the others on the Chambersburg Pike just behind Seminary Ridge. They then began to dole out more ammunition to whoever needed as regiments came up. And unfortunately, Confederate artillery now had found their range. Probably artillery from Rhodes' division, north of town, saw the wagons, which stood out like a sore thumb on the Chambersburg Pike, and began to shell them. In one sad instance, a shell came along, took out the rear legs of a pole mule upon which was seated a man named Indiana. He was one of the Teamsters. And wrote later on that the look on this poor man's face was just like losing a pet. He had trained those mules, he'd worked with those mules, that was the mule he rode, and the poor mule's legs taken out right from under it. Well, fortunately, a nearby soldier dispatched the mule, put him out of his misery, but then another mule was hit. And then a shell came along and took out the 2 wheels at the back of the wagon. So now the wagon's sitting like this, dragging on the ground. But Indiana, being the good soldier he is, was to be in the rear, he hitched those 4 remaining mules and got him into town, dragged that wagon all the way through town to Cemetery Hill. Well, by the time things started to collapse, Watchers has dilled out the last ammunition he's got. He starts to whip his men into town. The mule teams are going along, and here comes the 11th Corps collapsing back. Before you know it, the streets are just absolutely full. It's chaotic. The Confederates are closing in. There's bullets going zip, zip, zip over their heads. And O'Connor remembers trying to drive through town without driving over anybody and trying to keep the mules calm and get them through town. He finally gets them up to Cemetery Hill. Watchers gathers them all together in park, and he's looking at the wagons, which look like Swiss cheese. They've been riddled with bullets and shot and shell. Not a single wagon has been untouched. And who comes up to them? General Hancock. And Hancock approaches Watchers and says, "What have you got a wagon here for? What are you doing here?" And Watchers replies, "Sir, we just came back with the rear guard." And Hancock says, "Did you lose all your ammunition?" And Watchers replies, "No, sir, we distributed nearly all of it." "Did you lose any of your wagons?" "Well, I got back with most of them." Hancock says, "Good. It's the first mule train charge I ever knew anything about, and you did well, Sergeant." There's very few other instances of such bravery and action here involving mules that I could find. I'm sure there's other little stories out there. But after the war, after the Battle of Gettysburg, mules continued to support the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac throughout the rest of the war and the entire campaigns. In the overland campaign of 1864, at one point the wagons stretched from Fredericksburg, Brandy Station, and Quiet Creek to the Army of the Potomac's movements below Spotsylvania, nearly 60 miles at one point. Wagons constantly going back and forth, bringing supplies and equipment. If it hadn't been for these mules, these stubborn, cantankerous animals and their teamsters, the Army never would have succeeded. April 1865, the fall of Richmond, one of the first things into the city of Richmond, apart from some infantry, was the mule teams. I really like this image here. It's a mule team outside of the notorious Libby prison. And if you look real close, it's a really good example of what a mule team probably looked like about this time of the war. 6 mules, one of them is absolutely white as a sheet, and this little guy up here with the flag in his head, his halter. Without a doubt, though, mules play such a major role in the successes of the Union Army, not just in the East, but as well in the West. Western Theater as well, Sherman, all of them use mules to an extent. The last hurrah for the great supply trains was indeed the Grand Review in Washington in May of 1865. The mule teams were allowed to parade behind the infantry and the cavalry as they paraded up Pennsylvania Avenue. And one observer noted that the mules seemed to pick up with the spirit of the day. Instead of just lagging along with their ears down and their tails between their legs, they seemed to perk up. The heads held high, ears a twitch, tails a twitch, as they pranced down the street, almost like the finest charger they'd ever seen. That's pretty remarkable. It's the last hurrah of the Army Mule, though, because very soon after that, the armies all went home. What happened to the mules? The Army disposed of them. Some were sent out west, others were simply corralled. If they considered to be lesser quality, they were sent to the butcher, or they were sold. What's remarkable to me, too, is I have no doubt that if you'd been a visitor in the South in 1865, 66, 67, 68, you'd have seen a number of these old U.S. Army mules out pulling Southern plows. Because they were so cheap, they could be picked up for $1 or $2 just to get rid of them, that even Southerners were able to afford to buy a mule to plow their properties in the aftermath of the war. In Army lore, the mule had a certain soft spot in the hearts of soldiers. And mules are often talked about and referred to in many post-war writings and memoirs. It was remarkable to me as a young man when I first read Hard Tack and Coffee that Billings did devote an entire chapter to the Army Mule and its purpose, its reason, but it's almost like a loving chapter about these aren't just old cantankerous, bitties and hard to handle animals. These are really special animals that we survived on, that we were glad to see. Well, we put up with them, but we're always glad to see them. And in legend, in the aftermath, there's one story of the Battle of Hachi, if I can ever pronounce this right, Hachi, Tennessee. In October of 1863, it was an attempt by Longstreet's Corps to cut the Cracker Line to Chattanooga. The fighting went on in the afternoon all night long. And at one point, a number of the corralled mules that were attached to the Federal troops there broke free and charged through the woods in the middle of the night, supposedly into the Confederates, driving the Confederates back. And the next morning, the Union soldiers were amused by the equally frightened teamsters out trying to corral all these mules and bring them back in, and hopefully not get shot at by the Confederates who were not too far away. Now, unfortunately, myth is stronger than fact. Yeah. And this never really happened. It never really drove the Confederates back at all. They had been withdrawn by the time this mule charge happened. But the legends grew on. Even Grant mentioned that in his memoirs, how these mules had turned the tide at that particular battle. And some wag took a hold of Tennyson's famous poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, and he rewrote it, The Charge of the Mule Brigade. Half a mile, half a mile, half a mile onward, right through the Georgia troops, broke the 200. Forward the Mule Brigade, charge for the Rebs they neighed, straight for the Georgia troops, broke the 200. Forward the Mule Brigade, was there a mule dismayed? Not when their long ears felt all their ropes sundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs to make ribs fly. On to the Georgia troops, broke the 200. Mules to the right of them, mules to the left of them, mules behind them pawed, neighed, and thundered, breaking their own confines, breaking through Longstreet's lines, into the Georgia troops stormed the 200. Wild all their eyes did glare, whisked at all their tails in the air, scattering the chivalry there, while all the world wondered. Not a mule back bestraddled, yet how they all skedaddled. Fled every Georgian, unsabred, unsaddled, scattered and sundered, how they were routed there by the noble 200. If only that had been true. As I said earlier, John Billings wrote quite a bit about the Army Mule, and accompanied by Charles Reed's wonderful drawings of mules in the Army and their particular characteristics and the way the Army viewed mules. They could be cantankerous one minute, but also loving, caring pets, for lack of a better term, the next. And what struck Billings and stuck with a lot of others was the affection these old soldiers would have for the mules, even in the aftermath of the war, and how they remembered them. For the mules to be cheered if they're viewed by the soldiers that are bringing up commissary stores or the mail or whatever they're bringing up to the front, where the next minute they'd be vilified because they're blocking the roads, mired in the mud, and hauling and honkering and braying at the top of their lungs, driving everybody crazy. But the Army basically was done with the large mule teams. At the end of the war, there were no large supply trains like there had been during the American Civil War. Now, the Army did continue to use mules, but in a much lesser capacity out in the Western Theater, especially during the Indian Wars. Primarily, instead of hauling a lot of wagons, they were used more as pack mules. Pack mules accompanied Custer into the Black Hills of South Dakota in 1876. They accompanied Crook. They accompanied all the major campaigns out west. And even during the Spanish-American War, mules saw minimal usage by the Army during the Spanish-American War in Cuba and the Philippines. But the mule was not forgotten and carried on tradition. In 1899, West Point adopted the mule as their mascot. This was in response to the Naval Academy's appearance at the Army-Navy game with the goat. So the Army's going to respond with the mule. And people wonder, why the heck a mule, of all things? But if anything, the mule was a symbol of the Army, the symbol of the resilience and determination. As is written, the West Point mascot is the crossbreed between a horse and a donkey, just as it has been for the rest of the U.S. Army. It isn't the best-looking animal by any stretch of the imagination, nor is it anywhere close to being the most majestic. But of all the things it represents is strength, wisdom, stubbornness, and determination. That sums up the Army as a whole. And maybe so, because the mule is still today the symbol of not only just West Point, but as well as the Army in many respects. The mule continued service into World War I, and what's interesting about this, before America's entry into World War I in 1917, America had been one of the largest exporters of mules to the Allied troops and Allied forces in Europe. They sold mules to France, the French government, the British government, just about every government there that were fighting the Imperial German forces, the Americans sold mules to. America's entry in 1917, now they have to raise an entire army. And this is a time when the United States Army is not motorized. Everything is still pulled by horse or mule power. So, by the time the Allied Expeditionary Force gets to France, gets moving, gets cooperating with the tribe, they have to now scramble for mules. They don't have the ability to transport mules from the United States to Europe. They wind up buying mules back from the French government and the British government. In the middle of 1918, the AEF has approximately, let's see here, 5,900 cavalry horses, 32,000 draft horses, 28,399 draft mules, and 553 pack mules in France, all serving the American forces. They're hauling artillery, supplies, quartermaster stores, and commissary, exactly as they had done 50 years before during the American Civil War. At war's end, the AEF did not know what to do with the animals and the mules. They sold them, again, either going to butchers or sold them on the free market or sold them back to the government of France. And today, most of the ancestors of mules there in Europe are ancestors of the American mules sold by the American government to those governments in the beginning of World War I. The Germans also used the mule. Every army used mules for different resources, supply, demand. Armies were dependent on that four-legged, long-eared brute. Without them, these armies could not have moved or survived. The Army curtailed its use of mules after World War I because we were becoming a mechanized nation, as was the Army. So we saw less and less mule power and more gas-powered vehicles, trucks, tanks, other weaponry. In World War II, though, the Army found, as did the Marines, that mules were absolutely useful in North Africa, Sicily, and in the Italian campaign, as well as in the Pacific in Burma and other parts of the jungle environments. Merrill's Marauders famously used mules. They're officially known as the 5307th Composite Unit. It was a long-range penetration group that used mules specifically for supply because mules were so resilient to disease and what would affect soldiers there. Even they had some resistance to things like malaria, but the mules were absolutely useful. Same in Italy and the Italian campaign. And I was very fortunate to know a man, wonderful man named Charles Bradley, who was a muleteer in the Fifth Army in World War II. And I asked him, did you have any experience with mules before you went in the Army? He said, I never even led a horse in my entire life. They just picked me out of the ranks and said, come with me. Sergeant took me back and said, here's your mule team, get to know them. And Charles was always, he was very soft-spoken about this, but he marveled at night, he would take the mules up, usually had 10 or 12 mules in a line, all lashed each other. They would follow the most narrow trails up these steep hills, sure-footed, not a single mule ever, during his experience in the 10 months of campaign that he was there, not a single mule fell, lost its footing, or fell off a mountaintop, or lost its load. Not a single one the entire time. He does remember one experience, though. He was taking the shaved-tail lieutenant up, tied him somewhere at the center of the column, and said, you just hang on to this mule's halter, and we'll take you up. So Charles gets halfway up, and he looks back, and you can tell, even though it's pitch black, because it's at night, he's missing a couple of mules. So, oh no, so he ties his mules up. He goes back down the trail, he's following real quietly, and he can hear these mules down this little valley going in a circle. So he goes down and finds, here's his lieutenant. He pulled the rope, unleashed the mule, and was just wandering around, hanging on to this mule, lost. Well, this is the first time I think a corporal ever cursed out a lieutenant and got away with it. About 30 years later, Charles and his wife were sitting at a club in South Carolina playing bridge with some other folks, and they started talking about their service in the military, and the one fellow across from me says, oh, I was lieutenant in and Charles says, let me tell you a story about this idiot lieutenant. I had to take up the line, blah, blah, blah. So Charles goes through the whole story, and the fellow looks up kind of sheepish and says, oh, that was me. I love that story. Charles was a wonderful man. Unfortunately, we lost him a couple years ago. But the Army basically curtailed its use of mules after World War II. They had 2 pack mule teams still in Colorado for mountain training. By 1957, they decided that the mule system was over. The Army was done with them. And in 1957, they abolished the 2 mule teams that were out there. There are 300 some mules that they basically sold or transferred to the use by the National Park Service and the Forestry Service for the parks out west. And the mule system basically ended in the Army. But the Army was not done with the mule. And some of our veterans are going to recognize, especially Vietnam veterans, the mule that replaced the 4-legged furry creature is this little vehicle over here to the left, the M274 mule, moving platform, not much bigger than a large golf cart, was designed to carry the load of equipment that your average pack mule would use. Very useful, especially in the jungles of Vietnam and elsewhere. It was used by the Army for a number of years and was later replaced by other vehicles, including the experimental vehicle to the right, the multifunction utility logistics equipment vehicle, also called the Mule. You can imagine the planners trying to think of a name. We got to match Mule. Got to match Mule somehow. But in all cases, both vehicles proved to be unwieldy, especially in mountain fighting and mountain training, and they were noisy and sometimes difficult to maintain because they were all gas-powered, electric-powered vehicles. They just didn't work very well. So the planners went back to the planning board, and they came up with something. We've got to think of something that works more like a mule. What are we going to do? So they come up with this contraption, the LS3, which was the legged squad support system. Now, only the Navy and the Marines tested this for a couple of years, but they found out that this mechanical mule, for lack of a better term, though it was useful, was prone to breakdowns, needed a lot of technical assistance, and was just too noisy. It was just too noisy. Even though it didn't bray like a mule, it was just too noisy to be used in the field. So that program was discontinued. And I can only imagine what the planners were thinking when they discontinued that program is, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? How are we going to go back to the value of that original four-legged, long-eared galoot, the mule? The War on Terror brought up a new need for pack animals. And this wonderful photograph was taken at the Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center near Bridgeport, California, a couple of years ago. The Marines began to experiment again with pack mules. And that's where they trained them, and they have used them extensively in Afghanistan and some of the combat situations in Iraq. Pack mules are still being used today, not in great numbers, but in the mountain terrain where helicopters, vehicles, Humvees cannot go, the mule will take supplies up to the men that need it. It's really remarkable that we've come full circle. The mule is still a necessity, still well needed by our military forces in the field. Back to the Civil War. Hello. Can we try one more time? There you go. So who really had the last laugh? The mule. These hardy beasts toiled so long and hard through mud and wind and rain with little more than 20 pounds of grain and hay, 10 gallons of muddy water as their reward. The soldiers were eternally grateful, without a doubt. Almost every memoir, save a few, mentioned the views and the value of these mules to the armies. Without them, the armies could not have marched, could not have campaigned, and could not have survived, and probably could not have won the war. As I said earlier, John Billings, in his wonderful book, Hardtack and Coffee, devoted an entire chapter to the mule, and he imagined in the years afterwards how the mules were basically forgotten. They weren't the same as the horses that were winding up on monuments and in statues. The mules were just more or less forgotten. And he wrote a small poem, which I want to read to you at the very end of that chapter. The Army Mule in Time of Peace. That men are ungrateful could plainly be seen in the case of that mule standing out on the green. His features are careworn, bowed down is his head. His spirit is broken, his hopes have all fled. He thinks of the time when the battle raged sore, when he mingled his bray with the cannon's roar, when Uncle Sam's soldiers watched for him to come, hauling provisions and powder and rum, when his coming was greeted with cheers and huzzahs, and the victory turned on the side of the stars. These thoughts put new life into Rickety bones. He prances just once, then falls over and groans. A vision comes over his poor mulish mind, and he sees Uncle Sam with his agents behind, granting pensions by thousands to all who apply, from the private so low to the officer high, to the rich and the poor, the wise man and fool, but alas, there is none for the poor Army Mule. Just a reminder, we have a lot of other programs coming up. The winter lectures will run through March. If you have any questions, you want to tune into some. I see a lot of familiar faces here. I know you come all the time. Look at the park website at www.nps.gov/GETT/index. Not GET is on this slide, but GETT, and that'll get you their full schedule. Thanks for coming this afternoon. Hope you enjoy your visit here to the park and enjoy your day. Thanks. I've got some time. If anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to try and answer them for you. Yes?
You credited Charles Reed. I don't know if it's too hard to go back to the picture of Simon the Mule. But
I drew that.
I was going to say, I thought I recognized the great handiwork of a great artist in you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I drew that for a book Greg Koser published many years ago on this hologram. Yeah. It's after Charles Reed. I always admire his drawing. Yes.
So I guess another advantage of the mule is that females couldn't get pregnant.
That's right. Yeah.
So So they wouldn't have to worry about it.
Yeah, they wouldn't be bothered with thinking of what other animals were doing. Yeah, mules were
Sterile.
basically sterile, yeah, for lack of a better term. Yeah. Yes.
My great-great-grandfather was a wagoner for the Company G of the 14th Illinois Infantry. And when the war was over, he moved to Kansas. And every year, he would break and trade a pair of mules, and he could sell them for a section of land, which I think is 160 acres. And that's how he became sort of a land baron. So he would do that every year, buy a section of land, and then he ended up having 13 kids, and he taught his sons how to do it. So it benefited greatly after the war by what he learned as a wagoner.
That's remarkable. Yeah. I'd heard that a lot of former Teamsters, wagon drivers, went out west because that's where the business was. They didn't have much experience, so they didn't want to go back to farming. They went outside and were employed either by the railroads or military or contractors to haul freight. So in a lot of ways, the Western expansion and the desire, the need for mules, which were much more resilient than horses, grew during that Western expansion. So that's a great story. It's a great story. My ancestor was also a Teamster, the 116th Ohio. He was captured in 1864, and he lost his mules. So he just went back to farming. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us a little more about the Teamsters? Who were they? How did one get to become a Teamster? And racially, if you have any information about that.
Teamsters were a real crazy mix of different backgrounds. There were, as Grant said, there were a lot of foreigners, Germans especially, that said they had driven draft horses in Germany, whatever, and they became Teamsters or designated Teamsters. In the case of, I know my great-grandfather, 160th Ohio, he was a farmer, so he was just chosen to be the Teamster. There was a real racial mix in the quartermaster and ordnance and subsistence trains. Black served right beside white. In a lot of cases, a lot of the blacks, drivers at the beginning of the war, were not soldiers, they were laborers, so they were paid by contract for their time in service. They did not receive half as much as, say, like a white driver did. So for some of them, it was a matter of just survival. They could do this for mere pennies a month and at least be fed and have clothing and send some money home or something. It's really kind of a strange way of doing things. It wasn't until 1863-64, at least in the Union Army, they tried to say that all drivers, all Teamsters were actually members of the military. Now that's my understanding. I haven't done a lot more research in that background. But the legend comes down is not just the mules is what's well known, as the Teamsters are highly remembered. The situation with Cy Clegg and his pard is encountered with Groundhog, the baggage driver. He's beating his mules with a black snake. Groundhog was one of the lowest of the low, nothing but an ornery, mean old SOB and need to be beaten on. And Groundhog shows up throughout the Cy Clegg series and was very reflective of that writer's opinion, if not impression, of Teamsters during the war and their encounter with them. Like I said earlier, Teamsters were known to have a language, a gibberish all their own that the mules could understand, but they also could turn the air absolutely blue with the amount of cursing and swelling, and cursing, because that's what they thought the mules could understand. In some cases, probably the mules could. I remember as a kid growing up in North Carolina, though, this is back in the 50s and 60s, of some of the rural areas outside of where I lived, seeing two mules hooked to a plow. And this is, 100 years after the Civil War, mules are still being used to plow land in some of the rural areas of North Carolina. And I'm sure they've all been replaced today by tractors and things, but as a kid, I was always impressed by that some things haven't changed in well over 100 years, that mules are still being used down there. So, anything else? Yes?
Were there mules at Spangler's farm?
I don't know. The majority of farmers in Pennsylvania had draft horses rather than mules. So mules, and even in this area, were pretty rare. Draft horses, larger horses for hauling wagons and plowing, things like that, were more common throughout this area. than actual mules were.
The 1860 census did not list him as having any mules.
Okay, thanks. That helps. Hey, thanks again for coming, everybody.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, there we go.
Have a great day.